attending this evening's presentation because it's a very special one. We have a former ambassador, Edward O'Donnell, speaking. And I know that he agrees with me, as do all of the rest of the speakers, that we strongly believe it's essential to promote awareness and educate as many as possible on historical and contemporary genocides the world over, as well as other atrocities and geopolitical issues. Those are important for everybody to know about in this day and age. You're very fortunate to have this conference at which you can listen to survivors, activists, authors, academics, and politicians, to name a few, who will speak on crucial events that have impacted and are impacting the lives of millions. We have said ever since 1945, never forget and never again, over and over and over and over again. But since the end of World War II, there have been over 100 million deaths due to genocide. Think about that, 100 million deaths due to genocide. Let us listen now to someone who has worked in an area that deals with genocide and atrocities and such, and American policy. So let's listen to him and let's think critically. And then when you're finished and you finish with this conference, go out and act, do something to mitigate and to stop this scourge of mankind. If you have questions, feel free to type them in chat or in the Q&A. We'll be on top of that, and we can ask them at the end of his presentation. And he said, Ambassador O'Donnell has also stated that he's open to answering questions about people who are interested in a foreign service career. So don't hesitate to ask questions about those either. So Ambassador O'Donnell, he leads the Arizona State University course, Diplomacy in Action, the Embassy Country Team, and the International Affairs and Leadership Master's Program for Arizona State University. He retired from a career in the U.S. Foreign Service in 2007, after 33 years in Latin America, German-speaking Europe, and other positions in Washington, D.C. He served in Germany, Austria, Panama, Colombia, and Paraguay as chargé, Deputy Chief of Missions, Consul General, with a principal officer, Economic Counselor, and Commercial Attaché. In Washington, D.C., he was a negotiating ambassador concentrating on Holocaust issues, a democratic charter for the Americans and civil aviation rights. He was also the executive assistant to 3 undersecretaries and special assistant in policy planning and on the staff. So with no further ado, let us give a warm welcome to Edward O'Donnell, and I'm going to turn it over to him now.
Thank you, John, very much for that introduction. And thanks to all of you who are dialing in tonight and for your interest in my topic today in U.S. policy and U.S. programs and human rights and preventing atrocities and genocide. I'm a retired career Foreign Service officer and diplomat. Now I am a practitioner of foreign policy, a practitioner in the academic world at ASU, as Arizona State University, as John Lifton mentioned. I'm talking to you today from outside Washington, D.C., and I work out of the Barrett O'Connor Center in the heart of Washington, blocks from the White House, the ASU building, and that's where I teach the classes that John mentioned, both undergraduate and soon to be a master's program. So I'd like to talk to you about the topic, preventing atrocities and genocide, but also the people and the U.S. government and the Foreign Service that are a part of this effort. And I want to emphasize that my own views are what you're going to be hearing. I'm no longer with the U.S. government. I have no insight or special information. I do have friends in the government and out of government, and I've spoken to them for this presentation today, so I will share that with you. So if I could see the next slide. I'm not seeing the slides, but I have a friend and colleague, Kelly Morris, who's running the slides, so I hope they're working. So I'm going to...
I'm sorry about that. I'm going to need the ball in my court if one of the hosts can give it to me to share my screen.
Okay. We'll wait for technical pause.
I'm sorry, I'm not sure. What do I need to do, Matthew? Matthew, are you there?
Yes, go ahead and make Kelly the presenter.
Make Kelly be presenter. Okay.
Yes.
All right, I can do that. Okay, Kelly is the
There we go.
presenter. Sorry about that. Ed and Kelly.
We can adjust, not a problem. Great. Okay, thank you, Kelly. I can see the screen and I hope everyone else can as well. First, I want to state that the U.S. is committed to human rights and atrocity prevention. That's one of the foundation stones of our country over 200 years ago. And it's a commitment of our government, of our people, embodied in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And as the recent report to Congress, Elie Wiesel Act report for preventing atrocities and genocide, in the beginning of that report, it says, as such, the U.S. whole of government efforts to prevent and respond to atrocities remain a key national security and foreign policy priority. And I want to put that right up front for your consideration. And I'm going to give you examples of that as we go through this presentation. So there are two types of U.S. government involvement I want to talk to you about tonight. One is the grassroots diplomacy by U.S. Embassy country teams overseas. And those were my assignments as a Foreign Service officer. I'll tell you a little bit about them. And I also will talk to you about the strategic engagement from Washington, D.C. That's the policy level. That's what you hear about in the news more than often about policy decisions by the President, the National Security Council, and the State Department. And I also want to talk about the people, Foreign Service officers and U.S. government employees overseas and in Washington who are laying the foundation for U.S. values. And also by doing so, pushing for efforts that will prevent atrocities. So 42 years as a Foreign Service officer and U.S. diplomat. And as John said, if you're interested in the Foreign Service as a career, I'll be happy to answer a question about that at the end. So I'd like to give you examples of my career that reflect the engagement on human rights and preventing violence and atrocities in a way a Foreign Service officer in my generation did that. And so I'm going to use my own career as an example. That's the story I know best. It's about me, but I hope you'll bear with me while I go through this to give you a sort of a flavor of where I have my experience. So my first tour in Latin America was Colombia, then I moved to Paraguay. This was at the first part of the Carter administration. This is during the dictatorship of General Alfredo Stroessner in Paraguay. I was the political officer, junior officer in the U.S. Embassy Asuncion, and I was the human rights officer. So I met with families of persecuted individuals, the political opponents of Stroessner, who he had put in jail. He was a human rights violator. There were over 1,000 political prisoners, so-called communists. They were opposition people. They were human rights activists. They were people he didn't like. And so he was an old-style caudillo dictator. President Carter put human rights at the top of the agenda all over Latin America, Africa, around the world. So over the 4 years I was I was there 2 years. The Carter administration was 4 years. Over those 4 years, those 1,000 political prisoners were released, and a few were left. But because of U.S. diplomatic pressure, those people were released. President Carter's human rights policy, I think, was very effective in Latin America. And today, they're not. It's not like in the 1970s with dictators, military dictatorships all over Latin America. It's a much different world, and I credit President Carter for that. And I was involved in meeting with the families of the victims and reporting to Washington. The next experience in the State Department I want to mention to you is when I was economic counselor in Panama during the dictatorship of General Antonio Noriega in 1988 to 1990. And I was responsible for managing the economic sanctions. We the U.S. government wanted him to leave and release the power. He was the effective dictator and manipulated and the political scene. He stole an election in May of 1989. It was an election that the U.S. and other international organizations sent observers to. He stole the election. So this culminated in President Bush 41 making the decision to send in 20,000 American troops to remove him. Noriega was a human rights violator. He murdered press opposition people, and he was a money launderer, drug trafficker. So he was brought to justice in a U.S. court and also served time in France and back in Panama. But through that decision by President Bush, I feel that we changed Panama as a country. Today, it's a young democracy with change of government through elections, and they're managing an international waterway, the Panama Canal. I think that's what I would call a success of U.S. policy in removing that dictator. The next example I want to give you of my career is when I was the special envoy and ambassador for Holocaust issues. This was in 2003, 2006, President Bush 43 in his administration. I was earlier chief of staff to Undersecretary Stuart Eizenstat in the 1990s in the Clinton administration. And this was when Stuart Eizenstat was negotiating with the Swiss bankers and Germany, Austria, countries in Europe about unresolved issues of the Holocaust, trying to bring a measure of justice to Holocaust survivors who had not only been imprisoned in concentration camps, but also had their land and valuables, their apartments, and stolen, and bank accounts, insurance policies for the 6 million Jewish people who were the victims of the Holocaust. Those two had never been addressed. So Stuart Eizenstat negotiated those agreements for restitution, and I continued that work in the Bush administration. Also worked on the issues of Holocaust education, the Holocaust remembrance with nations of Europe to remember the lessons of the Holocaust, what happens with bigotry, hatred, and it leads to stereotyping, to violence, the other, and then eventually to violence, persecution of minorities, and atrocities and genocide. This is a delegation in 2005 that I helped put together. Governor Pataki was the head of the delegation, and it included rabbis and Jewish leaders, and also Catholic Archbishop Charles Chaput, also Kamal Nawash, who represented the Free Muslim Coalition. It reflected the diversity of America, both in religion and in other ways. And so we went to this meeting of the Organization of Security in Europe, OSCE, that met in Cordoba, Spain, and 55 countries came together and spoke out against anti-Semitism in Europe and committed to fight against anti-Semitism and other forms of intolerance, prejudice, hatred, bigotry. And we looked at best practices and made a commitment to take measures as governments to oppose that anti-Semitism that was growing at that time in Europe. And sadly, it's returned again today. Finally, I want to use as an example of my experience when I was in Afghanistan from 2011 to 2014. I was the senior advisor to the Minister of Counter Narcotics, an Afghan minister. I worked in the ministry every day for almost 3 years. And I worked with him, advising him on U.S. programs, helping fight opium poppy growing in Afghanistan and counter narcotics. But also we had a program for women to intern at the ministry, and these women were selected by the State Department to go to the Asian Women's University in Bangladesh for their college degree. So U.S. State Department money recruited 12 women every year and sent them to Bangladesh, first to learn English, then to get their college degrees, with the anticipation they would return to Afghanistan and become part of the government and part of the NGOs and part of the community. Many of these women were Shia Hazara women. The Shia Hazara community in Afghanistan is a persecuted community. When you hear of a bombing of a mosque in Afghanistan. It's more than likely a Shia mosque that the Taliban or ISIL have attacked. And so these women had the opportunity to leave Afghanistan and come back and intern with us in the summers. And it was, I think, a very important program. And I'm in contact with some of the people I worked with in the Ministry of Counter-Narcotics today, and I think they have come back to help make Afghanistan a better country. So now let me say a little bit more about grassroots diplomacy and talk to you about my colleagues in the Foreign Service who were in embassies overseas. And my engagement with human rights that I just recounted to you, it's not unlike a lot of other of my colleagues who at some point in their career and more than likely most of their jobs in some way promoted human rights and individual freedoms and helped stabilize communities and prevented violence and instability and crisis that could lead to atrocities. But the embassy country team, let me tell you about that. First, at the top of the embassy country team is the ambassador, and the ambassador's top priority in any embassy around the world where we have diplomatic relations is American citizen lives and the lives of other citizens of that country. Peace. Any ambassador wants peace and stability and wants to help stabilize a country that's fragile or help support those who want to bring democracy and human rights and personal freedoms, rule of law to the country. But the country team means that under the ambassador is a staff of anywhere from a few hundred to over 1,000 U.S. government people who are in the State Department, foreign affairs agencies, some domestic agencies, certainly FBI is represented overseas, and civil aviation, the FAA, and others. In the embassies I headed in Panama, I had 400 American citizens working for me, mainly State Department, Foreign Service, but also from 18 other U.S. government agencies. Same thing when I was Consul General in Frankfurt. I had about 800 Americans working for me, about 20 U.S. government agencies. And so in terms of human rights in the places I served where there were human rights violations or they were fragile or needed help and support for democracy and so on that the U.S. government and our funding programs could provide. We submitted annual reports to Congress on human rights, international religious freedom, human trafficking, anti-Semitism, justice for Holocaust survivors, and the Elie Wiesel Act for prevention of atrocities and genocide. Those are all reports that are sent to Congress annually. Starts at the embassy that reports what's happening in that individual country, goes back to Washington at the strategic level, is consolidated into a report about what's happening worldwide. The country team and those embassy officers also maintain contact with the host government and also persecuted minorities who are in country to let them know we care as a country, that the United States and other countries are watching what's happening in that country. And I think that does provide a measure of help and support to those persecuted minorities in countries at risk. And certainly we report back everything we hear to Washington to help influence the policymaking back in Washington. So next, let me speak a little bit about strategic diplomacy, and that is the Washington-based policymaking that is more well-known because of press reporting and starts with the president and includes the National Security Council, the State Department, but it's a whole of government approach. Any foreign policy issue like human rights, promoting human rights and democracy and individual freedoms and peace and also preventing atrocities, genocide. That's a whole of government engagement, and I'll mention some of those U.S. government agencies. And this is where the role of Congress comes in too, providing authorities to the State Department and the U.S. government, and also funding, appropriations, so we can implement our programs for promoting human rights. So let me start at the strategic level by saying there are two ways to divide this: long-range programs, policy and programs, and then the short-range. Long-range, I mean U.S. Agency for International Development and Peace Corps, and also State Department programs that promote, train prosecutors and judges for the rule of law, or empower women to know how to run for political office and teach them about democracy, or law enforcement to train law enforcement or military in a country to work in for democratic civilian leadership, or capacity building programs to bring economic stability to a country. So long range, these are the building blocks that create a stable, secure society that hopefully will be immune to the sort of fragility and the hatred, bigotry, and also conflict between groups, either political groups or ethnic groups. Short range, I mean the sort of things that happen quickly, crisis driven by civil war or ethnic conflict, or civilian casualties in wartime, or mass atrocities and genocide. These come up very fast, and the U.S. government needs to be very agile and quick in responding to them. And examples are of who's dealing with this, again, starting with the President, National Security Council, in the State Department, several of the offices I'm going to mention. But this is under our commitment as a country, responsibility to protect as a member of the United Nations. RP2, what we made as a commitment along with other member countries of the United Nations to make commitments to stop atrocities and genocide. And again, this is Foreign Affairs Agency's whole of government, the Washington-based policy setting that is so important for our efforts to work against atrocities and genocide. So the State Department, I would like to tell you about a few offices that are key to this whole process. First, the Ambassador at Large for Global Criminal Justice. And this is the office that works on policy for prevention, responses, and accountability, especially accountability for mass atrocities. So a few weeks ago, in preparation for this presentation, I talked to the incumbent, Ambassador Michael Kozak. And Michael Kozak I've known for many years, and he talked to me about what this office is doing today. And he's very much a key person in the Biden administration in defining policy. And he made the point that U.S. Embassy officers really do not have to wait for Washington instructions, that they're being trained to be to look at the precursors to atrocity. And if they can talk to the DCM and ambassador and show what's going on and do something, they should do it. They shouldn't wait. And we're inspiring the officers to take a common sense approach to preventing atrocities and genocide, to be engaged at the grassroots level. I also spoke with Ambassador Clint Williamson, who had this job when I was in my position of special envoy, and he was he had actually earlier in his career been a prosecutor in tribunals prosecuting the perpetrators. And he noted that the U.S. is the only country in the world that has this particular position at the ambassadorial level. It's a dedicated office for preventing atrocities and for response and for accountability, bringing the perpetrators to justice. And he admitted, as I will, the U.S. record in confronting these issues is far from perfect, but this office is an indicator of the U.S. government's commitment. And then Clint Williamson is a lawyer, by the way, and also a law professor at ASU, Arizona State University. Ambassador David Sheffer, I heard in a webinar, he's also a professor now, but he held this office when it was first created in 1999. And he also made the important point about policymakers need to be agile and quick, respond quickly without waiting for legal advisors to determine, and he's a lawyer, he says, the high bar of genocide definition. We can't wait for that. We've got to move when the indicators are going that the situation is worsening and people are at risk. The next office I want to talk about in the State Department that's key to preventing atrocities and genocide is the Bureau of Conflict and Stabilization Operations. This is the implementing arm, a programmatic bureau that manages the programs. The Ambassador at Large for Global Criminal Justice is a policy office. This is the program office. So the CSO, or Conflict Stabilization Operations Office, and the mission is to prevent and respond to conflict with 3 lines of effort: strategic prevention, conflict resolution, and security sector stabilization. So how do they do this? The young woman here in this photo is in Niger near Lake Chad. She is a stabilization advisor. She's been trained. She speaks the language. She knows the culture. She more than likely is assigned to the embassy in that country, or she could be a member of a stabilization team sent out from Washington to make an assessment. She engages with the community at the grassroots level. You see, she's talking to the women of the community, and she's reporting back to Washington what's going on. And this is the office that informs the rest of the State Department of countries in crisis, and they do a quarterly report that informs the rest of the U.S. government of those countries that are fragile and where the direction is going the wrong way and where we need to build more programs and be more on top of issues and help and provide support. The next office I want to talk about at the State Department is the Bureau of Democracy and Human Rights, DRL. Now, this is where my reporting from Paraguay on the human rights situation, it went to this office. And this is the office that consolidates all the reports I mentioned, the Human Rights Report, International Religious Freedom Report, Trafficking in Persons Report. And I spoke to David Kramer, who's a good friend from the State Department. He first was the president of Freedom House, and an NGO very important in the world of non-governmental organizations. And he was working on these issues of human rights and rule of law and democracy. And then he moved to be Assistant Secretary in the Bush administration for the Bureau of Democracy and Human Rights. And he made the point to me that in some cases, the non-governmental world have people on the ground closer to the situations than the security restrictions that are imposed on U.S. embassy or consulate people. And I know that. I've lived that in Afghanistan, where the embassy and security takes great measures to protect diplomats. But next generation, the other non-governmental NGO representatives in country, either NGOs from the host country or international ones like Freedom House, sometimes have much better access. They know the families, and they're able to find out what's happening on the ground and what's coming. Deputy Assistant Secretary Stephen Gillen, a ASU graduate, he's now moved on to another job, but in a webinar a few months ago, he also made this point about no substitute for personal contact with on-the-ground NGOs to find out what's going on, community leaders, that grassroots diplomacy. And this is the Bureau that issued the most recent Human Rights Report of 2020, which came out last week. And in that, in the introduction up front, is, and this is the Biden administration Human Rights Report to Congress now, with the imprint and approval of Secretary Blinken and President Biden. And it reads, unchecked human rights abuses anywhere can contribute to a sense of impunity everywhere. That is precisely why the Biden administration has placed human rights front and center in its policy. The next U.S. government agency I want to inform you about is Department of Justice. It has a very key role in the prosecution of perpetrators and those who are human rights violators. And they prosecute and seek out these individuals under federal criminal statutes that prescribe torture, war crime, genocide, and the recruitment of and use of child soldiers. And the office is the Criminal Division of Human Rights and Special Prosecution Section. You may know them from press reporting about Nazi perpetrators, concentration guard who have been discovered this many years later and brought to accountability and have lost their U.S. citizenship. The so-called Nazi hunters of Justice Department that sought out these individuals who were the perpetrators of the Holocaust. But it continues today, the work of the Department of Justice and the Federal Bureau of Investigation, FBI agents domestically, and also the legal attachés, as they call them in embassies, FBI special agents that are assigned permanently to embassies overseas. They are the ones that develop the information and help the prosecution of these perpetrators. In terms of the U.S. government and another department I want to mention, Department of Defense. I've met with my colleague and friend at Arizona State University, Lieutenant General Benjamin Freakley. He's the leadership and military advisor to President Pro, and he's a distinguished Army veteran and led the 10th Mountain Division in Afghanistan in combat. He was in combat 3 times. He's been on the ground. He knows the U.S. military, a career military officer, very distinguished. And so he broke out the military engagement in preventing mass atrocities and genocide in 3 areas. 1, prevention and deterrence. This is the Army Special Forces, Civil Affairs Units, Navy Seabees, and Marine Forces. They're engaged around the world through combatant commanders that they bring stability and knowledge of the culture, and many times they speak the language and traditions, and they try to de-escalate and de-conflict, and also help with capacity building. The U.S. Army engineers, when I was in Latin America, they built schools and health clinics, and they dug wells to bring economic stability to various areas. They're still doing that. U.S. Army engineers and also medical teams and civil affairs units. So I know of them from Latin America. U.S. Southern Command in Miami, the 4-star command is where that's all organized. That's the prevention and deterrence phase. The second phase General Freakley talked about was U.S. military intervention if ordered by the commander-in-chief. And that's when they're prepared and trained to go into combat if necessary. But their mission is to separate the combatants and the warring factions, number 1, and to restore the peace. And then in instances of atrocities or violence against civilians, if they discover mass graves or sites that show evidence of atrocities, they secure the site and report back to the civilian authorities, either the host country or diplomats or the United Nations or whoever's the appropriate authority, and turn those sites over and so they can be investigated. The third phase of military engagement to prevent mass atrocities and genocide is stabilization phase, and that's the post-conflict stage or post-genocide operation. This is actually stabilization and is what's going on in Afghanistan, Iraq, and other countries around the world, in Kosovo, historically, and other countries where the U.S. military rapidly downsizes and turns responsibility over to diplomats and host nation authorities. But the military can provide important security and stability and also protect persecuted minorities. And here you see soldiers delivering a USAID shipment to a community and talking to children, talking to leaders in the community. So how has the U.S. government done in terms of preventing atrocities at genocide? Let's look back. And it's very much a missed opportunity and a mixed picture, but there are, I think, areas and examples of when the U.S. government has made a difference. Certainly, we heard on Monday from the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum, those experts, about the 1930s, 1940s Roosevelt administration policy, the limitations and inability to expand visa quotas for Jewish families and save lives. Many Jewish families could have been saved with more visas. And the Roosevelt administration, you heard that story, you may know it from reading the history of that. Certainly that was a missed opportunity. In the 1990s, in the Balkans Wars, the ethnic conflicts and persecution of minorities, at the beginning of those wars, it was a European-led effort that did not succeed in ending the fighting and killing. That was ended later when U.S. government was involved, and I'll talk about that in a minute, but that certainly, there was a missed opportunity there to go in earlier, either in the Bush 41 administration or the Clinton administration. And then Rwanda genocide. I don't think I have to tell you about that. You heard about it with great precision and clarity last night. So where has the U.S. government made a difference? Well, I would say with the military victory in World War II that ended the Holocaust, the end of the Nazi tyranny and the Third Reich by U.S. military and allied efforts. And I would also point to the 1995 Dayton Peace Accords, Ambassador Richard Holbrooke and his team, Ambassador Chris Hill, General Wesley Clark, and others who, through diplomacy, with the strength of the military behind the diplomats, were able to bring an end to that war with the Dayton Peace Accords, and I believe it was November 1995. And then the U.S. NATO military intervention in Kosovo in 1999 that also ended that conflict. So I think there have been areas where we made a difference, and these are military actions and one diplomatic action. I give my students the recommendation to read Richard Holbrooke's book, To End a War. It's a great book for all of you if you want to know how to work through a diplomatic tough negotiation successfully. And he lays it out very clearly in that book. There are also successes that are less known or unknown by soft power or diplomacy or diplomatic policy and programs. And I've indicated that sort of foundation stone of economic development that goes on decade after decade. Certainly in my Foreign Service career, U.S. AID programs that provided development, sustainable development, and also democratic development and political development to countries where I was assigned in Colombia and Paraguay and all over Latin America. And I also think those AID programs and other State Department programs I mentioned to empower women in their communities have made a big difference. And I would point to Afghanistan, where women are going to schools now. When I would drive across Kabul to my job in the ministry, you see young girls with their backpacks going to school. There are more women at universities in Afghanistan, and that's happening, I think, in other countries, and women are moving into leadership positions, not only because of our efforts, but I think we did have a contribution that we made to empowering women in many communities and are continuing that as a part of our priorities. And then economic and political sustainability to create stable countries with representative government. Also, looking back, I would point out individuals. It wasn't just about the policy of the Roosevelt administration, but I want to pay tribute to U.S. Consul General Hiram Bingham, who was the U.S. Consul General in Marseille, France. In contravention to orders he got from Washington, he issued thousands of visas to Jewish families and Jewish individuals that saved their lives. There were other diplomats, Raoul Wallenberg in Budapest, who issued visas, and also a Japanese diplomat, Sugihara, who issued visas to Jewish families so they could essentially save their families and their lives and flee the persecution in Germany and Austria. And that was at a time when the Roosevelt administration was telling the Consul General and others around the world, no more visas for Jewish refugees. And this is one of the visas he issued that saved us. And also pay tribute to the U.S. military units, the soldiers, the American Army units, and other units that liberated concentration camps. And that their accounts are really telling that when they wrote home or came home and said, we knew then why we were fighting, when they saw the horror of those concentration camps. Individuals can make a difference. So looking forward, what needs to be done? Secretary Madeleine Albright, Secretary William Cohen, Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense, co-chaired a report, and this was the Genocide Prevention Task Force report, sponsored in large part by the U.S. Institute for Peace, U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum, and Academy of Diplomacy, American Academy of Diplomacy, a number of senior Foreign Service officers who served as ambassadors. And they made 34 important recommendations going forward as a blueprint for governments, how to stop atrocities and prevent genocide. That report was very important, and I think a lot of their recommendations have been enacted. Also looking forward, my colleague at Arizona State University, ASU's first ambassador in residence, Michael Polt. I served with him in Panama during the Noriega dictatorship. I served with him in Europe, and he was the U.S. ambassador to Serbia. And I think he put it correctly, and I agree that what he said, human rights policy needs to be an integrated part of our overall foreign policy and not relegated to a separate track. I agree, and many diplomats today, and I think others in the administration today agree with that. And then I'd like to point out a comment I heard in a webinar by Alice Nadiratu, who's the special advisor to the United Nations Secretary General on preventing genocide. And she comes from Kenya, and she's been active in this world in Africa for many years. And she said that community-based solutions are extremely important to prevent atrocities and genocide. And then she pointed out the importance of the role of women in atrocity prevention. They tend to broaden the set of issues beyond just power and wealth sharing. They address the underlying drivers of conflict. And she points to South Sudan, the genocide in Darfur, and how women engaged in those talks at the community level and made a difference. So let's look at the Biden administration. They've been in several months, and I want to start with President Biden and what has he said about this issue of human rights, preventing atrocities, and genocide. In 2011, at the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum, he said, "Preventing genocide is an achievable goal. Too often in the past, these U.S. government efforts have come too late after the best and least costly opportunities to present them have been missed." Also, I know Senator Biden from 2003, when I testified before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee on what the U.S. government, State Department was doing to work against anti-Semitism in Europe and other forms of intolerance, bigotry, and hatred. And Senator Biden spoke very powerfully and directly about supporting the U.S. government and State Department on all of our efforts to work against anti-Semitism and other forms of prejudice in Europe. And he called out European leaders specifically to do more. That was when he was a senator in 2003. And then look at the statements of Secretary of State Tony Blinken. Starting with January 27th, he was just days in office, and he made a very powerful statement in a webinar about the importance of Holocaust education. And he noted that he was a next generation of Holocaust survivors. And so he very deeply feels the importance of educating young people in the United States, around the world, in Europe, about the lessons of the Holocaust. What happens with bigotry, hatred? It evolves into violence, atrocities, and genocide, the lessons of the Holocaust. And then in March, he testified before the House Foreign Affairs Committee and talked about what the administration had done to that point in terms of democracy and human rights and conflict diplomacy. And just to name a couple of things here, we rejoined the UN Human Rights Council. There was a presidential proclamation that U.S. diplomacy would protect the human rights of LGBTQI people worldwide. He noted that the administration had imposed sanctions on Russia because of the poisoning and detention of Alexei Navalny. They've also imposed sanctions in response to the military coup in Burma, so that those military leaders, if they have assets in the United States, those bank accounts are frozen. They're denied entry into the United States, visas, and other targeted sanctions against the perpetrators of that military coup. And then conflict diplomacy. We suspended the U.S. government suspended the sale of offensive weapons to Saudi Arabia and named a special envoy to lead the diplomatic efforts to end the war in Yemen. I also have recently heard that Senator Coons has been named a special envoy and traveled to Ethiopia, Eritrea, and the Tigray region to try to bring peace as a direct messenger and envoy from President Biden. So the Biden administration has been active, and I think there are also a number of laws since 2018 that are the basis of the action of the State Department and other government agencies, embassies overseas, and also lay the groundwork for the prosecution of the perpetrators. And that starts with the 2018 Elie Wiesel Genocide and Atrocities Prevention Act. It includes the Global Fragility Act of 2020. These were all signed into law by President Trump. The Saudi Arabia Accountability in Yemen Act of 2019. There's 8 of them, and that lays the groundwork and authorities and also funding for the state embassies overseas to take action. Before I end, I want to also mention heroes of the Foreign Service. Foreign Service officers I served with who tragically gave their lives in service of their country. First, Deputy Assistant Secretary Robert Frazier. He died in Bosnia-Herzegovina in a vehicle accident. He was in an armored car. He and a Deputy Assistant Secretary from the Pentagon, an Air Force colonel, were killed in that accident. They were on a mission to get to Sarajevo to deliver another draft of the peace proposal. They were part of Holbrooke's negotiating team. When they died, and also there were parts of that team, several of those members that were badly injured in that accident. Richard Holbrooke said, "I've lost 3/5 of my negotiating team." Robert Frazier certainly gets credit, and the others who perished in that accident get credit for the success of the Dayton Accords, in my view. Ambassador Chris Stevens also gave his life for his country. He knew Libya more than any other U.S. diplomat or European diplomat. He spoke fluent Arabic and had been in Libya many years, and he was there to try to bring peace and stability, to work between the warring factions, to bring stability to that country. Also, when I was in Afghanistan, I want to mention Ann Smettinghoff, a public affairs officer who died tragically in 2013, a suicide bomber. Ann was on a mission, a remote area of Afghanistan, with a team who were delivering school books to Afghan children, science and math books, to help with the education of young people in Afghanistan. With her was another public affairs officer who was badly injured, and also 3 members of the U.S. Army who were part of the security of that team died in that suicide bombing. So these 3 individuals are examples of Foreign Service officers in harm's way and committed to human rights, preventing atrocities and genocide, and they certainly should be recognized along with the members of the U.S. military in the same fashion and the same mission to stabilize countries around the world, and U.S. military soldiers in Afghanistan, Iraq, and elsewhere in the world who either gave their lives or were badly injured. So, ladies and gentlemen, that concludes my presentation, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you for your interest in the topic of U.S. government and preventing atrocities and genocide.
Thank you very much, Ambassador O'Donnell. That's really a very informative presentation. And I think everyone can have hope now that things will improve under the new administration. Certainly seems like it's, I mean, what you've been saying and what people feel within the Foreign Service is considerably different than what we've been hearing for the last 4 years. We have a lot of questions. And some of them are may take a while to answer. There's one here from an individual, and he says, since the end of the Cold War, it seems like now more than ever, nuclear armed nations or nations with a military on the scale of the U.S. are committing atrocities. How can the United States help those who are victims of countries like China without triggering an international problem?
That's a very good question and a very tough one, and it's right there front and center in the Uyghur issue of the treatment of the Uyghur minority in China. And certainly since the end of the Cold War, or even before then, the major powers are involved in, like China and Russia. I mean, I think that's where soft diplomacy and new tools of diplomacy are important. And I think we should be very careful in terms of committing the U.S. military in any situation, in any country. That is sort of the last tool that, in terms of bring stability to countries or stopping violence, we should use every diplomatic tool we can. And that certainly in China, we have made our views known, and in terms of sanctions against those who can be identified. U.S. Department of Commerce, for example, is blocking imports into the United States from areas where there's essentially slave labor. Uyghur people are being exploited in producing exports from China. And so there are a number of tools that are not well known. U.S. Treasury Department, Office of Foreign Assets Control, names specially designated nationals. Those are individuals who are behind these sort of atrocities or what's happening. So as they're identified, they're putting on a list. It becomes then a criminal penalty under U.S. law if a U.S. company deals with them. That's what I used as economic counselor in Panama for Noriega and the people who were supporting him, the thugs around him, to put their names on a list. Same thing in terms of China and the treatment of the Uyghur population, and of course the statement by Secretary Pompeo that the Uyghur situation was a genocide, that's been confirmed by the Biden administration, and I think that's very powerful. And so I think one of the other ways that we need, not just bilaterally, but we need help in terms of the international community and the United Nations. So speaking out against China and what they're doing to the Uyghur population, that needs to be done. And I think this is not only my idea. I've heard this from other diplomats that are pursuing this, but in the Security Council in the United Nations, any multilateral organization that we're a part of with China, we should be speaking out against the treatment of the Uyghur people. The more pressure on them diplomatically, the better. And that's the phase, and that seems to be the commitment of the Biden administration now.
Okay. There's a question, specific one on Sudan here. What are your thoughts around Sudan's Prime Minister Abdullah Hamdok and his new cabinet? Is this a genuine step towards improvements in human rights in Sudan, or is it just another smokescreen?
Well, I have to tell you, I'm not an expert in Sudan. I know it as one area of concern, the early warning networks. And I was in the State Department when Secretary Powell sent in AID advisors to evaluate the situation in Darfur, whether or not a genocide was taking place. And it was. He declared that that was in 2002, as I remember. But I'm not an expert on Sudan today, so I can't really make a comment about that particular government. But I know there are U.S. diplomats on the ground engaged and reporting back to Washington, and I can imagine what the diplomatic tools are that we're using both at the grassroots level and from the embassies and from Washington. But I don't have any specific information on that.
Okay. One student has asked, how many countries does the U.S. have an embassy in? I mean, like South Korea and Iran, we don't have an embassy or so, but.
I think it's 170. It's in the range of 165, 170 where we have diplomatic relations. It changes from month to month because of security problems. We have in the past, actually since the killing of Ambassador Stevens, we've had to close embassies in various countries like Libya and Yemen and various countries in Africa as the situation gets very dangerous for diplomats, because there's a balance here between being on the ground, being present, knowing what's going on, and protecting American lives and protecting the diplomats or the country team members who are engaged. And so that number changes, but I think it's on the range of 165 countries.
Okay. And will the United States ever become a member of the International Criminal Courts? I mean, we have people now looking at American atrocities in Afghanistan and such, and we're all for that, in terms of Africa and other places, but it seems like hands off us.
Well, I'm not a lawyer and I'm not an international lawyer or in that world, but I did talk to Ambassador Clint Williamson, who's a professor at ASU Law School, and he held that job of Ambassador at Large for war crimes. And I think his view is the President Biden administration is going to have to look at a way to deal with the International Criminal Court. We did not join it because and this is a historical issue that I'm probably not the best one to describe, but we very much have supported all the tribunals on former Yugoslavia and Rwanda and Sierra Leone. In fact, the U.S. government, according to Clint Williamson, is the #1 funder and also has been very active in the prosecution of the perpetrators who've been brought to justice. So we work through the tribunals very actively and very directly in terms of funding and also lending our expertise in terms of prosecution and bringing them to justice. But in terms of the International Court of Justice, we are not a member, and that goes back, I think, really to a feeling by U.S. Congress that the International Court of Justice is for countries that have fragile judicial systems. And the United States has a very strong and vibrant judicial system. So it's for countries that, the first instance, according to Clint Williamson, is that perpetrators should be tried in their home country, in their home court, brought to justice. But if the judicial system is not that developed in terms of prosecution, courts, and the rights of the accused, then that's where the tribunals come in and the International Court of Justice. At least that's my understanding of Congress's view and the administration.
Okay, we've got about 3 minutes left, and so I'm gonna do 2 questions at once to try to so you can go from one to the next one on your own. The first question is, we've had several people ask, do sanctions work? So that's the first question. The second question is, it comes out in statements that several people have said, we help with foreign countries with aid and such, but nonetheless, we have civil issues, civil unrest here in the United States. And so shouldn't we get our own house in order before we start helping others? And then there was someone who quoted the Chinese consul who basically said that, saying the Uyghurs are okay, and basically saying the U.S. should get its own house in order. Again, piggybacking on that last contentious issue of, how much do we help foreigners when we have such a mess ourselves? So the first one, sanctions, and the second one, house in order.
Well, in terms of sanctions, I think it's a mixed picture. I think we're getting better at what's called smart sanctions that are targeted against the perpetrators and not a blunt instrument that affects the people. And what I mean by that is, when I was in Panama, there were economic sanctions against Noriega's, the people around him, and some of those were business people, so they couldn't do business with the United States. There were also U.S. companies that face criminal penalties if they sold to the government of Panama. They were like IBM and other U.S. investors. They pulled out of Panama. So that was sort of a blunt instrument that hurt the economy and the people of Panama. But if you can target them against individuals, that hurts. And it does work, especially when we can get the European Union and other countries to put sanctions on those individuals, the perpetrators, those who want to travel to the United States. They want their kids to study here in college. When they can't get a visa because their father is a perpetrator, a member of the military coup, that hurts. So I think in those cases, the more targeted the sanction, the better. In terms of our own house in order, we do. Thank you. Well, thanks to all of you for listening and being here. And I'm on the with John Lifferton and other talented researchers, academics, experts on preventing atrocities and genocide. I'm on the board for Genocide Awareness Week next year in 2022. And the Genocide Awareness Week for the 10th year now and congratulations to John for 9 years of success and what you've done. We're moving to Arizona State University, and it will become a joint project with Northern Arizona University and the University of Arizona. And we hope to see you April 2022, and we will continue very much the commitment that John and all your colleagues and donors of the Genocide Awareness Week have about education, about the Holocaust and other genocides. So thank you for being here tonight. Thank you for your support, and look forward to seeing you next year, hopefully in person. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much, Ambassador O'Donnell. I appreciate that. Last comment here before we break is tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. We have Dr. Barlow Dermugudashian from Cal State Fresno. He's the head of the Armenian Studies Department, and he will be talking about the 105th anniversary of the Armenian genocide. After him at 10:30, we have Dr. Eva Schaller, who will be speaking on Holocaust by the bullets. And later on that night, we have the presentation by Dr. Windley Lauer, who has just come out with a new book called The Ravine. I urge you to purchase this and read it. It is riveting in a horrible way about explaining her research about Holocaust by the bullets. 6 million Jews were murdered by the Nazis, but in the first part of the war, especially in the Ukraine, Poland, and Russia, there were no gas chambers and such, and they were murdering the Jewish community along with some others like the Roma and such by shooting them, executing them with bullets, thus Holocaust by the bullets. So I look forward to seeing you there tomorrow for these important discussions, and I hope that all of you have a very good night. Oh, by the way, if you do have any questions, you can always write Ambassador O'Donnell through ASU. He's happy to answer questions that way as well. And believe me, he does answer his email. I know. So I look forward to seeing you tomorrow. And thank you very much again, Ambassador O'Donnell. And I hope all of you have a very good evening.